Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AAS YouTube channel and this installment of the AAS Author Series. And I'm really happy, my morning, to have Tamara Rogers with us today. Hi, Tammy.
Hi, Frank.
How are you today?
Good. Yeah, good. Weather's been good in England, so, you know.
Oh, sunny.
Well, not today, but generally it has been, and that's not, normal.
So where in England are you?
I'm in Newcastle, which is the very northeast of England, not too far from Edinburgh.
Okay, very cool. And what do you like to do for research?
So I do simulations, numerical simulations, hydrodynamics, MHD, generally of stars and giant planets. Yeah, and I guess I've always done computational things. Multi-D hydro, basically.
Cool. I see you have a few pictures of dogs on your wall there, so maybe we want to give viewers a heads up.
Yeah, so it's possible that my dog decides to bark and run and get his toy and whatever, and I can't really do much about it because he's deaf and he just randomly decides to bark.
Awesome.
So I'm going to try not to move, and that should not upset him. He's asleep. Kind of.
Find out. You have been warned, people.
Yes.
Okay, let's go ahead and get into your lovely 2017 APJ letter on the chemical mixing induced by internal gravity waves. And Tammy, take it away.
Okay, so as you know, or probably lots of people know, there's a lot of inconsistencies between observations and 1D stellar evolution models. And in particular, there's issues with rotation, rotational evolution, and predictions about what kind of chemical species we should see at surfaces of stars, for example. And that all comes down to mixing and angular momentum transport in stellar interiors. Of course, most of our modeling of all of it is stellar evolution is one-dimensional, and almost all of these problems can ultimately be traced back to how we deal with multi-dimensional problems like mixing and angular momentum transport, turbulence, convection, overshoot, and all those sorts of things.
Indeed.
As I'm sure you're very aware. So I've done a lot of work on convection and waves, and in particular on waves, internal gravity waves. So those are like the waves in the ocean and the waves in the atmosphere that we see. And trying to understand how those waves might contribute to the evolution of stars. And there was a predecessor to this paper that was about how internal waves contribute to the rotational evolution of stars and transport angular momentum. And because there's been, go ahead.
That was 2015, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and even before that, there's been quite a lot of, I think, discussion and quite a lot of papers about internal gravity waves and what they can do to rotation in stars. And it's a bit problematic because most 1D stellar evolution models treat all mixing as a diffusive process. And internal gravity waves are, and I know the Geneva Code does something slightly different, but anyway. Right. But the internal gravity waves are very, very strange in that they really cannot be treated as a diffusive process, at least in terms of angular momentum transport. And that's known from the atmospheric science community, from lots of research. That just can't be done. Okay. So the goal of this particular paper was to say, okay, well, that's angular momentum transport. It has a direction. Momentum is a vector. That's a weird thing. Let's set that aside and say, what about actual mixing, right, of species, not angular momentum? Okay. Can the mixing properties from internal gravity waves be treated like diffusion? And if so, what does that diffusion coefficient look like?
Yep.
And how do we put that into a 1D stellar evolution model?
Cool.
So that's what this paper is about. So we took some simulations, some 2D simulations I had done from the 2015 paper, and a whole swath of a lot of 2D simulations. And those simulations, do I scroll here or do you scroll here?
Scroll. You tell me where to go. You're driving.
Go to the second, go to the third page actually. We might have to scroll back up. So that's kind of it's hard to see in this picture, but this was a 3 solar mass model. We took the 1D, the 1D background states, the density and temperature and all that from, I think this one used an old Cambridge stellar evolution code. And then we do, it represents an equatorial slice of a star. So the internal part, the reason you can't see it, there's lots of particles in there, but that's all convection. And it's, mixing the particles up quite a lot. And then the outer 85% of the simulation is a stably stratified region, just like a 3 solar mass star would have, convection in the center, stable stratification in the outer part. And that simulation goes from about 0.05, 0.1 of the stellar radius out to about 90, 95%, I can't remember exactly. And so we had these simulations that we'd run the hydrodynamics on just to see, what the waves do in terms of angular momentum transport. And then what we did is we took the simulations, all the data, we kept a lot of data from those simulations and put in tracer particles. And then if you go up, and it wasn't...
So in this figure, the tracer particles are
the white dots.
The white lines. Okay, got it.
The white they're actually little dots. And it's hard to see, but they're actually little dots. And you can see from A is how the simulation starts. There's no convection or waves happening. And then D, there's the waves you can see have moved those particles just a little tiny bit, right? And you can kind of see they're wavy.
Yeah, okay.
And in the convection zone, pretty much immediately all the particles are mixed up, right? So they're put on these these lines, and then they're immediately mixed up. So you know that mixing in convection is very efficient, right?
Yep.
But even, these simulations, they're not run for that long. I mean, not in terms of stellar evolution, they're not run for that long. But you can see the particles have moved, even in the radiation zone. And so that's actually quite a lot of movement for the time scale under which these simulations were run. So the first...
Sort of how many convective turnovers or something?
Oh God, there's probably 1,000 convective turnover times in these simulations. So lots and lots of convective turnover times. Yeah. And so it's not entire. So you put the particles in there, and then you have to sort of interpolate all their movement, and it's not. Well, it sounds very straightforward. It should be very straightforward. Numerically, it's a little bit more challenging. But anyway, so the equations, 1 to 10, well, actually 1 to 6, are just the equations for, you have a particle, it moves, it has some trajectory, and over some time scale, what's the density of particles, then what's the mean squared displacement of the particles, and then the diffusion coefficient associated with those particles. And you consider all time differences. So if you have, 100 time steps, you consider 10 to 0, 10 to 9, 10 to 8, all the different time steps, time differences, and you calculate the trajectories of the particles for all those different time differences. And you come up with a displacement and eventually a diffusion coefficient by those equations 1 through 6.
Right, so these are passive scalars.
Yes, they're passive scalars. Yeah.
Yep.
So there, another way you could do this in a hydro simulation is put in a separate equation for chemicals, right? An advection diffusion equation. But the problem with that is then you have to put in a diffusion coefficient, and then everything starts depending on the ratios of the various diffusion coefficients.
Yeah.
So it's numerically a little bit more stable to try and do it this way.
Okay.
Anyway, and you could do it in post-processing. If you have enough velocity data files, then you can do that.
Yep.
So if you scroll down, we basically use that equation 6 to effectively get a diffusion coefficient from the movement of, well, first we have to ask the question, does the particle movement even behave like diffusion, right? It's not clear a priori that a wave motion should induce necessarily diffusion behavior.
Right.
So diffusive behavior. So if you go down to, I think it's the second figure, I think, in a long time. Yeah, so figure 2. So the top figure there is the mean squared displacement as a function of time differences. So what I should point out is that smaller time differences have way more data, because if you have 100 time steps, you can get a time difference of 10 in a lot of different manners: 90 minus 80, 80 minus 70, 11 minus 1, et cetera, et cetera. But you can only get the very large time differences from less data, you see?
Right.
So you can only get 90 from, 100 minus 10, or, from 5 different, a few different data points.
Right. You just see larger time steps with less, you got less.
You've got less data in these very large time differences, right? So, but what you can see is certainly, for the lower time differences where you have a lot of data, that's a fairly straight line. So mean squared displacement versus time is a fairly straight line. That means it's basically a diffusive process. So a straight line, centimeters squared over seconds, effectively, that's diffusive. So what we say is, for time differences which we can resolve, which we resolve well, then it's fairly clear that it's a straight line, or straight line-ish. And so mostly the particle movement can be described by diffusion.
What causes from a straight line starting at around?
I don't know, there's a bit of wiggle in there, but anywhere from 1 times 10 to the 6 up to about 5 times 10 to the 6.
And it's linear. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much depresses a little bit.
What's that?
Then it's sort of the slope changes. It depresses a little bit.
Yeah, a little. There is some variation there for sure.
Okay.
But so then we say, okay, for these time differences, which we have lots of data, we say it mostly behaves like diffusion. I should say that if we did this, so those 3 different colors are 3 different radii within the radiation zone. If we plotted that mean squared displacement as a function of time in the convection zone, it would definitely not be a straight line.
Definitely not.
Right? Convection doesn't behave like diffusion. Still, anyway, but that's, so this is only within the radiation zone. Those colors represent 3 different radii within the radiation zone, which are reflected in part B of that figure. So those 3 radii. And so what we did is we basically calculated the diffusion coefficient at every radius, right? So if you put in 1 million particles or 100,000 particles or whatever, you can get a diffusion coefficient at every radius. And that's what's plotted in the second part of that figure. And so if we say, forget everything in the convection zone, that's all not diffusive anyway. We have this profile as a function of radius. Now at the top, you can't trust what happens at the very top, so you should sort of only look up to about 0.7.
Yeah.
0.7-ish, right?
Okay, yes.
Yeah. So then we say, and we looked at this diffusion coefficient as a function of radius for just a lot of different models with different parameters and different numbers of particles. We varied all the things we could vary, and the actual amplitude of the diffusion coefficient varies a little bit, but that profile with an increase towards the surface doesn't vary. It's robust.
Yeah, and just to make sure I'm reading that right, the diffusion coefficient between those three radii is of the order of 10 to the 8, 10 to the 9 centimeters squared per second?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Now, I don't, those numbers are dictated by the diffusion coefficients within the simulation.
Yeah.
So the actual values, I'm not so, hung up on. I'm not sure about those actual values, although I don't think they're that far off from a lot of the values that are used in for example, the Geneva Code.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So anyway, but that's kind of secondary. So we want to understand what sets that profile, the rise towards the surface of the diffusion coefficient.
Okay.
So we said, so those two lines, the black dashed lines that aren't vertical, that sort of that border the actual solid line there, those are density of rho to the -1/2 and rho to the -1. Density for rho. So that's what density to the -1/2 and density to the -1 look like.
Okay.
And there's a reason I did that, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we're trying to understand what sets this profile. So the first thing we did is said, well, what are the convection zone velocities? And that's in figure 3.
Uh-huh.
And so over the course of the simulation, for numerical reasons, the convective velocities kind of come down, and we purposely allowed it to do that because we wanted to see how the diffusion coefficient varied as the convection zone velocities varied. And so what's plotted there are the sort of RMS velocities in the convection zone, that's the black asterisks.
Mm-hmm.
And then the diffusion coefficients at 2 different radii within the radiation zone.
Okay.
And as you can see, as the convective velocities come down, the diffusion coefficients come down, and pretty in step.
Lockstep, yeah.
Yeah. So we said, oh, okay, so clearly the diffusion coefficient in the radiation zone has something to do with the convective velocities, right?
Yes.
And so then the next thing is that profile, most people, if you looked at the previous one, the diffusion coefficient with it ticking up with the radius, if you work with waves in stellar radiation zones at all, you recognize that looks like a wave amplitude. So waves in stars that are, bigger than the sun, where you have a convection zone in the center and a radiation zone at the outer parts, their wave amplitude can increase as the wave moves outward because the density is dropping so dramatically, and the wave amplitude goes as density to -1 effectively.
Huh?
So the wave amplitude can increase. Of course, there's other things happening to the waves. They're being dissipated by thermal diffusion. They're interacting with each other. There's a lot of things that are happening, but one of the primary things that's happening is that the amplitude's increasing because of the density stratification.
Okay.
And it affects different waves differently. So high frequency waves are not subject to radiative diffusion, at least not so much. And so their amplitudes can grow very high, and low frequency waves are more likely to be dissipated by thermal diffusion.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that looks a little, so when I saw this, I thought, oh, that looks like a wave amplitude effect, right? So if you go to the next page, what we did here is we're again trying to understand what's setting the diffusion coefficient in the radiation zone. Now there's been some work in the planetary atmospheres community, possibly in stellar interiors as well, about what sets a diffusion coefficient, and it's often a local RMS velocity of some sort. So what we did is we plotted in black here is the RMS velocity squared, and in blue is the diffusion coefficient, and in red is the wave amplitude squared. Instead of an RMS velocity, a wave velocity. And the difference is correlation. So, you know, a wave is correlated over time for long periods of time. And so you can see that the diffusion coefficient kind of follows the wave amplitude squared pretty well, not perfectly, but you know, a lot better than the RMS velocity.
Sure. Okay.
And those lines there are to do with what a theoretical prediction of a wave amplitude would be if you summed over some set of frequencies, etc.
That would be the black lines?
The black lines.
The black lines, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it depends on, and the wave amplitude will depend on what your thermal diffusion is that you set. And of course, in these hydro simulations, you have to set them larger than they actually are, right? In the real stars. And so that sort of is the difference between this the solid black line is the line you get if, let's see, for the diffusion coefficient we used in the simulation.
Okay.
And then the other, let's see, the other lines, the dashed and dotted ones, are what you get if you use the thermal diffusion from a MESA calculate, from an actual 1D stellar evolution code.
Okay.
Yeah. And the reason there are two is just depends on the spectrum of waves you assume.
Right.
So if you go down to the equations that are below here, so we said the wave amplitude goes something like the amplitude at which the wave's generated, which we're going to say is the convection zone velocity, times density to the -1/2, that's a pseudo-momentum sort of amplification of a wave, pseudo-momentum conservation amplification. And then the e to the -tau is the damping associated with the radiative diffusion. And as you can see, that damping depends on the frequency and wavelength of the wave, as you would expect. And so we said that the mixing coefficient is some hand-wavy coefficient, right?
You call it A.
Times wave amplitude squared, because we can see that in the figure above, that it kind of goes like the wave amplitude squared. And that tau is this diffusion, is basically to do with the different waves being dissipated different ways. So if you assume some spectrum of waves with some frequencies and some wavelengths, and you calculated their amplitude as a function of frequency and wavelength, and then you did some integration over all those wavelengths, you can put that into your e to the -tau, and you have some wave amplitude squared kind of thing. And so the idea is that actually, what you really want, if you're doing something like this, the ultimate thing I'm trying to do is take lessons we learn from hydro simulations or MHD simulations and try and make reasonable prescriptions for them for 1D stellar evolution, right? And actually test them against simulations, so that's the ultimate goal. So we said, actually, if you assume some kind of spectrum of waves, and then you had your density stratification, which you have, of course, from your 1D model. You also have your Weissler frequency and all those kind of things from your 1D model. You could calculate the diffusion coefficient. My dog is awake now, so beware. He's tapping at the back of my anyway. So you could put this into a 1D stellar evolution code, this prescription. And if you wanted to do it really, really stupidly, like, even if you just put in rho to the -1/2, you would get something, vaguely okay. And that would be, so then you could run some stellar evolution calculations and then test them against observations. And there's some nuances to do with that coefficient. but one of the things we're working on now, so I work a lot with Connie Arts and her team.
Okay.
And so, you know, astroseismology can pin the diffusion coefficient at the interface. I have to say I'm a little skeptical about those numbers because they seem crazy to me. they're crazy low, right?
Crazy small. Okay.
Yeah, they're crazy small. So, you know, if you saw those numbers, they're order 10 to the 10, 10 to the 8, etc. Those are kind of standard numbers that are in a lot of stellar evolution codes that come out of a lot of theory, etc. And astroseismology is coming up with numbers that are at the largest 100.
Ooh.
Yeah. So it's very, there's some weird things going on there, but you could pin that number, and then you could, if you had observations where you have astroseismology that you can get the inferred properties in the interior, and you had spectroscopy so you could get the surface abundances,
right,
then you can try and actually recreate that profile and test this prescription. So one thing Gabe Peterson is her name. She's a PhD student for Connie. She's about to actually go do a postdoc with Lars at KITP.
Right.
She's been doing a lot of that, trying to figure out what we can, you know, what kind of information we need from observations to pin down these mixing coefficients, what we can actually learn from astroseismology about that. And
now that I think about it, actually, we'll be hearing from May here in about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
She's lined up.
Yeah, it's Mai, by the way.
One of her pieces of work. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, so that's one of the things we're working on a lot. Our teams together is, you know,
cool.
Okay, so we do something in simulations. Maybe we can pin down that A. If we had enough astroseismic observations that were, you know, all banged in that number, then we could maybe pin that number down. If we had some spectroscopy, we could try and pin down the number at the surface, put that into a 1D stellar evolution code, and see what kind of things, you know, we can get out of it. So that's sort of the ultimate goal, is to really to get better handles on, you know, what are, I think rightly, I think that it's rightly thought of as very hand-wavy kind of arguments that go into the diffusion coefficients that are in stellar evolution codes.
Sure.
And so we're trying to like get a handle on this, you know, in some maybe slightly more, you know, detailed way, by including the simulations, trying to include the observations, go back to the 1D stellar evolution models.
That's great.
Yeah.
Awesome program. Sounds like the future is bright for doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, I hope so. It keeps me in business, right? So, yeah, well, that's the main things we're trying to do. We're trying to do it in 3D. Mm-hmm. That's, you know, it's very difficult. This particle tracking in 3D is going to be quite a nightmare. And yeah.
Certainly if you want to keep it live, right? Right.
Yeah.
Well, very good. And so these are those calculations, you're not doing an explicit calculation, right? They're inelastic or?
No. So the code is anelastic, but what that means is we have explicit diffusion coefficients in the code, right? So there is no magic with regard to what the Reynolds numbers and things like that are. They're explicit, we know them, and we can vary them. We can in a controlled way so that we know how they affect our results. Mm-hmm. So anelastic just means that we can't do shocks effectively, mm-hmm. and we can't go to the very surface, because up there you start to get very fast speeds.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, fast compared to the Mach number.
There we go.
Yeah.
Awesome. Tammy, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure, and I'm so glad that I met your dog.
Yeah. Did he get in there? Was he?
He definitely is in there. He's realized on YouTube now. So
He's a very famous dog in these parts. So
yeah. And so if you would like to go ahead and contact Tammy about her work, or contact her dog, if you would like to do that, you can do that. So you know how to find her. She's out there. We're not going to put her info in the YouTube information or on video here, but go ahead and reach out to Tammy, and we'll get it rolling. All right.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Frank.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.